The emergency room doors burst open as paramedics wheeled in a man barely clinging to life. His uniform was torn, blood seeping through the fabric, his face pale as death itself. Detective Marcus Thompson lay unconscious on that gurney, his life hanging by a thread after a brutal attack during what should have been a routine traffic stop. But here's what no one in that hospital knew. Here's what would make this story one of the most incredible tales of redemption, forgiveness, and divine intervention you'll ever hear. The surgeon who would fight to save Detective Thompson's life, the man whose skilled hands would piece him back together, was Dr. James Williams. And 20 years earlier, when James was just 16 years old, Detective Thompson had arrested him. Not for something minor, not for a misunderstanding. Marcus Thompson had cuffed that scared black teenager, thrown him into the back of a police cruiser, and sent him into a system that could have destroyed his entire future. Yet tonight, that same teenager, now a world-class trauma surgeon, would become the only person standing between Marcus Thompson and death. How does a story like this even happen? How do you go from handcuffs to healing hands? From the worst day of your life to becoming someone's guardian angel? Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story that will challenge everything you think you know about justice, mercy, and the incredible ways life comes full circle. Before we dive into this incredible journey, I want to thank you for choosing to spend your time with this story tonight. These are the real stories that matter, the ones that remind us that our worst moments don't have to define our future. If this story moves you, and I promise it will, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? Drop a comment and let me know what city or country you're tuning in from. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Detroit, Michigan, summer of 2003. The city was still reeling from economic collapse, neighborhoods hollowed out, hope in short supply. But on Corktown's east side, in a small house with a chain-link fence and roses struggling to bloom in the front yard, lived the Williams family. James Williams was 16, and if you met him, you would remember him, not because he was trouble, but because he was the opposite. Honor roll student at Cass Technical High School, captain of the debate team, already talking about pre-med classes at University of Michigan. His mother, Dorothy Williams, worked double shifts as a nursing assistant at Detroit Medical Center, and his father, Robert, put in long hours at the Ford plant. Every morning, Dorothy would wake James at 5:30, not because he had to be at school early, but because she wanted to see him before her shift started. "Baby," she'd say, straightening his collar even though it was already perfect. "You remember what we talked about. You keep your head down, you stay focused, and you don't give nobody no reason to look at you sideways." James would nod, kiss her cheek, and grab his backpack stuffed with textbooks that he actually read. He was everything his parents had sacrificed for, their American dream, walking around in sneakers and a school polo shirt. But here's what the Williams family knew, that their neighbors might not have understood. Being a good kid, being smart, being respectful, being everything right, didn't make you invisible. Sometimes it made you more visible. Sometimes it made you a target for people who couldn't believe that a young black man from the East Side could be carrying textbooks instead of something else. Marcus Thompson knew this too, but from a different perspective. He'd been patrolling Detroit's streets for 8 years by 2003. 32 years old, married to his high school sweetheart Sarah, father to twin daughters who were 7 years old and thought their daddy was the greatest hero in the world. Marcus had grown up in Detroit too, but on the northwest side, in a neighborhood that gentrification had touched just enough to give families like his a fighting chance. His father had been a police officer, and his grandfather before that. For the Thompson men, the badge wasn't just a job, it was a calling. But 8 years on, the force changes you. 8 years of seeing the worst of human nature, of responding to calls that haunt your sleep, of making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between going home to your family or not going home at all. Marcus had developed what cops call hypervigilance. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every movement could signal danger. Every encounter could be the last. The morning of July 15th, 2003, started like any other. Dorothy Williams kissed her son goodbye and headed to the hospital. Robert Williams drove to the plant. James grabbed his summer school books and started walking the 12 blocks to Cass Tech for his advanced chemistry class. Marcus Thompson kissed Sarah goodbye, hugged his daughters, and started his patrol shift on the east side. Neither James Williams nor Marcus Thompson had any idea that by sunset both of their lives would be changed forever. The call came in at 2:47 p.m. His suspicious person in the area of Bagley and 23rd Street, possible drug activity. Marcus Thompson was 6 blocks away when the dispatch crackled through his radio. Suspicious person calls were routine, usually amounting to nothing more than someone walking through a neighborhood where residents didn't recognize them. But in 2003, Detroit, with drug-related violence spiking and community tensions running high, every call had to be treated seriously. James Williams was walking home from summer school, his chemistry textbook under one arm, a notebook full of equations in his free hand. He'd stayed late to work on a project about molecular structures, completely absorbed in the kind of academic challenge that made him feel alive. The afternoon sun was brutal, and he'd taken off his school polo shirt, walking in just a white t-shirt and jeans. He was thinking about college applications, about the essay he needed to write for the University of Michigan pre-med program, about how proud his parents would be when he got accepted. He was 17 years old, and the future felt bright and certain. Marcus Thompson turned onto Begley Street and immediately spotted him, a young black male, late teens, no visible school identification, walking through a neighborhood that had seen 3 drug arrests in the past month. The training kicked in instantly. Assess the situation. Look for signs of suspicious behavior. Trust your instincts. James was walking with purpose, but to Marcus it looked like someone trying to move quickly without appearing to run. James was carrying books, but from a distance, Marcus couldn't make out what they were. James had taken his shirt off because of the heat, but to Marcus, it could have been an attempt to change his appearance. Marcus slowed his patrol car and pulled to the curb about 30 feet behind James. He watched for a moment, following protocol, assessing whether to approach or continue observing. That's when James made the mistake that would change everything. He saw the police car in his peripheral vision and felt his mother's voice in his head. You don't give nobody no reason to look at you sideways. So he did what seemed logical to a 16-year-old honor student who'd never had a negative encounter with police. He turned around and started walking toward the patrol car. In James's mind, he was being respectful. He was showing that he had nothing to hide, that he was willing to cooperate with whatever the officer needed. In Marcus's mind, a suspect had just spotted law enforcement and was now approaching in what could be an aggressive manner. Marcus got out of his car, one hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon, the other reaching for his radio. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority of 8 years on the force. "I need you to stop right there and put your hands where I can see them." James stopped walking, confusion washing over his face. He looked around to see if the officer was talking to someone else. The street was empty except for the 2 of them. "Any?" James asked, his voice cracking slightly the way teenage voices do under stress. "Yes, you." "Hands visible, please." James raised his hands, still holding his chemistry textbook and notebook. To him, this was compliance. To Marcus, it looked like someone potentially concealing something in their grip. "I need you to put down whatever you're holding and step away from it." This is where the story could have gone differently. This is the moment where understanding could have replaced suspicion, where communication could have prevented catastrophe. But fear has a way of making people speak different languages, even when they're using the same words. James bent down slowly to place his books on the sidewalk. "Officer, I think there's been some kind of mistake. I'm just walking home from school." Marcus saw rapid movement toward the ground and heard words that sounded like a challenge to his authority. His training screamed at him to control the situation before it escalated. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Now." "But I haven't done anything wrong," James said, and the confusion in his voice came out as what Marcus heard as defiance. That's when Marcus made the decision that would haunt him for the next 20 years. "You're under arrest." The handcuffs went on while James was still trying to understand what was happening. The chemistry textbook lay open on the sidewalk, pages fluttering in the afternoon breeze, molecular diagrams scattered like broken dreams. The holding cell at the Detroit Police Department's 4th Precinct was small, cold, and filled with the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everything look sickly and hopeless. James Williams sat on a metal bench, still in disbelief, still waiting for someone to realize the mistake that had been made. He'd been fingerprinted, photographed, and charged with loitering with intent to commit a crime. The arresting officer, Detective Marcus Thompson, had written in his report that the suspect appeared nervous, was walking in a high-crime area, and became argumentative when approached. None of it was technically untrue. James had been nervous, but nervous like any teenager would be when confronted by police for no reason. He could understand. He had been walking in a high-crime area, but it was the neighborhood where he lived, where his family had lived for 8 years. He had been argumentative, but only in the way that someone argues when they're trying to understand why their world has suddenly turned upside down. Dorothy Williams got the call at Detroit Medical Center at 4:15 p.m. Her supervisor found her restocking supplies in the cardiac unit and said there was an emergency call for her at the front desk. "Mrs. Williams, this is Officer Patricia Gonzalez with the Detroit Police Department. Your son, James, has been arrested and is being held at the 4th Precinct." The world stopped. Dorothy had seen enough in her years as a nursing assistant to know that life could change in an instant. She'd watched families get devastating news, watched hope turn to despair in the space of a heartbeat, but she never imagined that call would be about her James. "Arrested for what?" "There has to be some mistake." "Ma'am, you'll need to come down to the station to get more information. I can tell you he's safe and unharmed." Robert Williams left the Ford plant in the middle of his shift, something he'd never done in 15 years of employment. He and Dorothy drove to the 4th Precinct in silence, both trying to process a reality that made no sense. At the station, they met with Detective Laura Morrison, who explained the charges: loitering with intent, possible drug-related activity, failure to comply with lawful order. "But he was coming home from school," Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's in the summer program at Cass Tech. He's never been in trouble in his life." Detective Morrison looked at the file again. She'd seen hundreds of these cases, and most of them followed predictable patterns. But something about this one felt different. "Mrs. Williams, does your son have his student ID with him?" "He should. He always carries it." They checked James's belongings. Student ID, library card, his acceptance letter to the University of Michigan summer chemistry program, and $17 in cash. Detective Morrison looked at Marcus Thompson's report again, then at the evidence, then at the parents sitting across from her desk trying to understand how their honor student's son had ended up in handcuffs. "I'm going to recommend that the charges be dropped," she said finally, "but the arrest will remain on his record." Robert Williams spoke for the first time since they'd arrived. "What does that mean for his future?" "It means that when he applies for college, for jobs, for anything that requires a background check, this arrest will show up. He'll have to explain it." Dorothy Williams felt something break inside her chest. Not just her heart, but her faith in the system she'd raised her son to respect. "So even though he did nothing wrong, even though you're dropping the charges, his future is still damaged." Detective Morrison nodded. "I'm sorry, that's how the system works." James was released at 7:30 p.m. He walked out of that police station a different person than the one who'd been walking home from chemistry class 5 hours earlier. The world looked different now. The rules he'd been taught, the faith he'd had in justice and fairness, the belief that being good and working hard would protect him, all of it had been shattered in the space of an afternoon. At home that night, the Williams family sat around their kitchen table and tried to figure out what came next. The University of Michigan application asked about any arrests or criminal charges. James would have to check yes and explain that he'd been arrested for walking home from school. "We have to fight this," Robert said. "We have to appeal, get the record expunged. Something." Dorothy was looking at her son, seeing the change in his eyes, the way his shoulders carried a new weight. "Baby, what do you want to do?" James was 17, but he felt decades older than he had that morning. "I want to become a doctor," he said quietly, "and I'm not going to let this stop me." But across town, Marcus Thompson was having his own crisis of conscience. He'd gone home to his family, kissed his daughters, and tried to enjoy dinner with Sarah. But something nagged at him about the arrest, something about the kids' confusion, about the textbook left open on the sidewalk, about the genuine bewilderment in his eyes. After Sarah and the girls went to bed, Marcus pulled the case file and read through his own report. Then he drove back to Bagley Street and found the chemistry textbook, still lying where James had dropped it, pages now damp with evening dew. He opened it and saw James's name written carefully in the front cover, along with his address and phone number. Below that, in his mother's handwriting, "If found, please return to James Williams. He needs this book to achieve his dreams." Marcus Thompson sat in his patrol car on that empty street, holding a teenager's chemistry book, and realized he might have just destroyed an innocent kid's future. The next morning, Marcus Thompson did something that went against every protocol in the Detroit Police Department handbook. He looked up James Williams' address and drove to the small house on Corktown's east side. It was 6:30 a.m., and Dorothy Williams was getting ready for her shift at the hospital when she heard the knock on the door. When she looked through the peephole and saw a police officer standing on her porch, her first thought was that something had happened to James, that somehow the nightmare from yesterday was continuing. She opened the door with her heart pounding, and Marcus Thompson found himself face to face with a woman whose eyes held all the pain and confusion of a mother trying to protect her child in a world that seemed determined to destroy him. "Mrs. Williams? I'm Detective Thompson. I was the officer who arrested your son yesterday." Dorothy's hand tightened on the doorframe. Behind her, James appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by voices that sounded tense and urgent. "I brought his book back," Marcus said, holding out the chemistry textbook. It was still on the sidewalk. Dorothy looked at the book, then at the officer holding it, trying to understand why he was standing on her porch at 6:30 in the morning. "James," she called softly, never taking her eyes off Marcus. "Come down here, baby." James walked down the stairs slowly, his eyes fixed on the man who had put him in handcuffs less than 24 hours earlier. Up close, without the uniform creating distance between them, Marcus looked younger than James had remembered, more human. "I read through the case file again last night," Marcus said, his voice quieter than it had been during the arrest. "And I think I may have made a mistake." The words hung in the air like a confession. Dorothy's voice was steady, but steel-hard when she spoke. "A mistake? Officer, my son was walking home from school. He's never been in trouble in his life. He's going to the University of Michigan in the fall, or at least he was, before you decided he looked suspicious for carrying chemistry books in his own neighborhood." Marcus felt each word like a physical blow. "Ma'am, I understand your anger. I understand why you'd be upset. But I need you to understand something too. I've been patrolling these streets for 8 years. I've seen kids younger than James dealing drugs, carrying weapons, caught up in situations that get people killed. When I see someone acting in what appears to be a suspicious manner, I have to respond."
"Acting suspicious how?"
James spoke for the first time, his voice stronger than Marcus had expected. "By walking, by being black in my own neighborhood, by trying to cooperate when you approached me." Marcus looked at this teenager, really looked at him, and saw something he'd missed yesterday in all his assumptions and protocols and training. He saw intelligence, dignity, and a pain that Marcus had put there. "You're right," Marcus said, and the admission seemed to surprise all three of them. "I was wrong." Robert Williams had been listening from the kitchen, and now he joined his family at the front door. 4 people stood in a space meant for polite conversation, but the weight of the moment made everything feel cramped and charged with electricity. "Being wrong doesn't fix his record," Robert said. "Being wrong doesn't undo what you did to his future." Marcus nodded. "You're absolutely right, but maybe I can try to make it right." Over the next hour, sitting in the Williams family's living room, Marcus Thompson heard a story that changed his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his job, his community, and himself. He learned that James had been accepted to University of Michigan's pre-med program with a full academic scholarship. He learned that James tutored younger kids in the neighborhood, that he volunteered at the community center, that his biggest dream was to become a doctor and come back to Detroit to help people. He learned that Dorothy Williams worked 16-hour days to support her son's education, that Robert Williams had turned down overtime opportunities so he could help James with homework, that this family had sacrificed everything to build the kind of future that one arrest could destroy. And James learned something too. He learned that Marcus Thompson had grown up in Detroit, had joined the police force because he wanted to make his community safer, had twin daughters he worried about every day. He learned that Marcus lay awake at night sometimes, wondering if he was making the right decisions, if he was protecting people or just adding to the cycle of pain and mistrust that seemed to define relationships between police and the community. "I became a cop because I wanted to help people," Marcus said, "but yesterday, I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I hurt a family that's doing everything right. And I don't know how to fix that." Dorothy Williams looked at this police officer sitting in her living room, holding her son's chemistry book like it was something precious, and saw something she hadn't expected. She saw regret, real, genuine regret. "You can't fix it," she said quietly, "but maybe you can learn from it." Marcus spent the rest of the morning at the 4th Precinct, filing paperwork to have James's arrest record sealed and expunged. He called in favors, pushed through red tape, and used every connection he had to make sure that James Williams's future wouldn't be defined by one afternoon's misunderstanding. But the damage went deeper than paperwork could fix. James withdrew his University of Michigan application. Not because he had to, but because something in him had broken. The faith he'd had in justice and fairness, in the belief that good people were protected by good systems, was gone. "I don't want to be around people who see me as a threat before they see me as a person," he told his parents. "I need to get out of Detroit." 3 weeks later, James Williams accepted a scholarship to Howard University in Washington, D.C. He was leaving behind everything he'd known, everyone he'd loved, because staying felt like accepting a world where he would always be seen as suspicious first and human second. The night before he left for college, Marcus Thompson drove by the Williams house one more time. He didn't stop, didn't knock on the door. He just sat in his patrol car and watched as James carried boxes to a car packed with everything he owned. Marcus had tried to make it right, but some things can't be fixed once they're broken. Some wounds run too deep for apologies to heal. He watched James Williams drive away from Detroit, and he knew he was watching a young man leave home, not because he wanted to explore the world, but because he no longer felt safe in the only world he'd ever known. 20 years passed like pages turning in a book you can't put down. James Williams graduated from Howard University summa cum laude, completed medical school at Johns Hopkins, and finished his residency in trauma surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital. He became the kind of doctor who could save lives that other doctors had given up on, who could perform miracles with steady hands and an unshakable focus. But he never came back to Detroit. Marcus Thompson rose through the ranks of the Detroit Police Department, eventually becoming a detective specializing in community relations. He implemented programs designed to bridge the gap between police and the neighborhoods they served. He mentored young officers, teaching them to see people as individuals rather than statistics or threats. But he never forgot James Williams. Every July 15th, on the anniversary of that arrest, Marcus would drive by the old Williams house. Dorothy and Robert had moved away years earlier, but Marcus still drove by, still thought about the teenager whose life he'd changed with a pair of handcuffs and a failure of imagination. On the night of July 14, 2023, Detective Marcus Thompson was finishing up a late shift when a call came in about a domestic disturbance in the same neighborhood where he'd arrested James Williams 20 years earlier. It should have been routine, the kind of call he'd answered thousands of times in his career. But Michael Reeves, the subject of the domestic disturbance call, was high on methamphetamines and armed with a knife when Marcus arrived. What should have been a conversation turned into a fight, and what should have been a fight turned into something much worse. Reeves caught Marcus off guard, slashing at him with the knife before Marcus could draw his weapon. The blade found the space between Marcus's vest and his collar, opening his throat and chest. Marcus managed to call for backup, but by the time other officers arrived, he was unconscious and losing blood fast. The ambulance rushed him to Detroit Medical Center, the same hospital where Dorothy Williams had worked all those years ago. The paramedics radioed ahead: incoming trauma, police officer, multiple lacerations to neck and chest, significant blood loss, ETA 3 minutes. Dr. James Williams was finishing a 14-hour shift in the trauma unit when the call came in. He'd been in Detroit for 6 months, having finally returned to the city he'd left 20 years earlier. His mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, and James had taken a position at Detroit Medical Center to be closer to family during her treatment. When the paramedics wheeled Marcus Thompson into Trauma Bay 3, James saw the uniform first, then the man wearing it. Time seemed to slow as recognition dawned. This was the police officer who had arrested him 20 years ago. This was the man whose split-second decision had changed the trajectory of James's entire life. Marcus was unconscious, his face pale from blood loss, machines beeping urgent warnings about dropping blood pressure and irregular heart rhythms. James had about 30 seconds to decide whether to save this man's life or ask another doctor to take the case. 30 seconds to choose between the past and the present. 30 seconds to decide what kind of person he wanted to be. James Williams stepped forward and began to save Marcus Thompson's life. For the next 4 hours, James fought for a man who had once seen him as a threat. He sutured arteries, repaired damaged tissue, monitored vital signs, and used every skill he'd developed over 20 years of medical training to keep Marcus Thompson breathing. At 3:47 a.m., Marcus Thompson's eyes opened in the recovery room. The first thing he saw was Dr. James Williams checking his chart. "Welcome back, Detective Thompson," James said quietly. "You gave us quite a scare." Marcus's throat was bandaged, his voice barely a whisper when he spoke. Do I know you?" James was quiet for a long moment, studying the face of the man who had changed his life 2 decades earlier. Marcus looked older, grayer, worn down by 20 years of carrying the weight of keeping people safe, but his eyes were the same. July 15th, 2003, James said finally, "Bagley Street, you arrested me for walking home from school." The recognition hit Marcus like a physical blow. His heart monitor began beeping faster as the memories flooded back. The teenager with the chemistry book, the family sitting in their living room, trying to understand how their world had been turned upside down. The young man who had left Detroit because he no longer felt safe in his own neighborhood. "James Williams," Marcus whispered. "Dr. James Williams now," James said, and there was something in his voice that Marcus couldn't quite read. "And the surgeon who just spent the night putting you back together." Marcus tried to sit up, but the pain and the tubes kept him flat on his back. "I don't understand. Why are you here? Why are you helping me?" James pulled up a chair and sat down beside the bed. For a moment, he was 17 again, sitting in that police station cell, trying to understand how his life had changed so completely in the space of an afternoon. "Because," James said finally, 20 years ago, you taught me something important. You taught me that life isn't fair, that good people can be hurt by systems that are supposed to protect them, and that sometimes the world is cruel for no reason at all." Marcus felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. "James, I'm so sorry. I've thought about that day every year since it happened. I tried to find you to apologize properly, to make sure you were okay." "I know," James said. "My mother told me about the expunged record, about the paperwork you filed. She also told me about how you changed after that day, about the community programs you started, about the young officers you mentored." Marcus was crying now, tears running down his cheeks as 20 years of guilt and regret poured out of him. "I destroyed your life. I took away your future." James was quiet for a long time, thinking about the path that had led him from that sidewalk on Bagley Street to this hospital room, from handcuffs to healing hands. "You didn't destroy my life, Detective Thompson. You changed it, and maybe that change was exactly what I needed." Over the next 3 days, while Marcus Thompson recovered in Detroit Medical Center, he and James Williams had conversations that both men had been needing for 20 years. James told Marcus about Howard University, about the professors who had seen his potential and nurtured it, about the classmates who had become lifelong friends, about the experiences that had shaped him into the man he'd become. He talked about medical school, about the first time he'd saved a life, about the calling he'd found in trauma surgery. "If you hadn't arrested me that day," James said during one of their conversations, "I might have gone to University of Michigan, stayed in Detroit, lived a completely different life, maybe a smaller life." Marcus struggled to understand. "But I hurt you. I hurt your family. I made you leave everything you knew." "You did," James agreed. "But you also sent me on a journey that made me who I am today. Howard University was where I learned to be proud of my heritage, where I met mentors who looked like me and showed me what was possible. Medical school was where I discovered that I could turn pain into purpose, that I could use what happened to me to help other people." Marcus thought about his own journey over the past 20 years. The community programs he'd started, the young officers he'd mentored, the relationships he'd built with families in neighborhoods where police were traditionally seen as enemies rather than protectors. "I became a different kind of cop because of what happened between us," Marcus admitted. "I started seeing people as individuals instead of potential threats. I started asking questions instead of making assumptions." "Then maybe we both became who we were supposed to be," James said. On Marcus's 4th day in the hospital, Dorothy Williams came to visit. She was 72 now, her memory beginning to fade, but her eyes were still sharp when she looked at Marcus Thompson. "Detective Thompson," she said, taking his hand in both of hers, "my son tells me you're the patient who's been keeping him busy." Marcus tried to speak, but emotion choked off his words. This woman, whose family he had hurt, whose son he had traumatized, was holding his hand with the same gentleness she might show any patient's family member. "Mrs. Williams, I owe you an apology that's 20 years overdue," Marcus finally managed. Dorothy smiled, the same smile that had comforted James through childhood, scraped knees, and teenage heartbreaks. "Honey, you don't owe me anything. Look at my boy. Look at what he's become. Sometimes, the worst things that happen to us lead us exactly where we need to be." That afternoon, James took Marcus in a wheelchair to the hospital's chapel. It was quiet there, peaceful, with afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows in patterns of blue and gold. "I have something to tell you," James said, "something I've never told anyone." Marcus waited, sensing the weight of whatever confession was coming. "After you arrested me, I was angry for a long time. Angry at you, angry at the system. Angry at a world that could judge me so harshly for nothing more than the color of my skin and the neighborhood I lived in. That anger almost consumed me. James was quiet for a moment, remembering the darkness of those early college years. But eventually, I realized that carrying that anger was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. I had to let it go, not for your sake, but for mine. I had to forgive you so I could become the person I wanted to be. Marcus felt something break open in his chest. 20 years of guilt and shame finally finding release. The night you were brought into my trauma bay, James continued, I had a choice. I could let the past define the present, or I could choose to be the man my parents raised me to be. I could choose to be a healer rather than someone seeking revenge.
Why?
Marcus asked. Why would you save the life of someone who hurt you so badly? James thought about the question, about all the moments that had led to this one. Because that's what love looks like, he said finally. Not the easy love we show to people who treat us well, but the hard love we show to people who hurt us. The love that says every life has value, every person deserves a second chance, every story deserves a better ending than the one that seemed written in stone. They sat in silence for a while, two men who had been forever connected by one moment of misunderstanding, now finding peace in a place of forgiveness and grace. 6 months later, Detective Marcus Thompson stood at the podium of the Detroit Police Academy, looking out at a room full of new recruits. These young officers would soon hit the streets, carrying badges and weapons and the enormous responsibility of protecting and serving their community. I want to tell you about a young man named James Williams, Marcus began, and he told them the story of a 16-year-old with a chemistry book, a scared police officer with too many assumptions, and a moment that changed 2 lives forever. He told them about the importance of seeing people as individuals, about the danger of making judgments based on fear rather than facts, about the power of admitting when you're wrong and the courage it takes to try to make things right. That young man became Dr. James Williams, Marcus said, and 6 months ago, he saved my life. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. He chose forgiveness over revenge, healing over hatred, love over fear. The classroom was completely silent, these young officers absorbing a lesson that couldn't be found in any training manual. Every day, you're going to go out into this community and make decisions that will affect people's lives. You're going to meet people on what might be the worst day of their lives, and how you treat them in that moment will matter forever. I'm asking you to remember James Williams, and I'm asking you to choose to see the humanity in every person you encounter. That same day, Dr. James Williams was in surgery at Detroit Medical Center, saving another life, using hands that had once been cuffed behind his back to heal and restore and give people second chances. After his shift, he drove to the small cemetery where his father Robert was buried. He sat beside the headstone and told his father about Marcus Thompson, about forgiveness, about the strange and beautiful ways that life comes full circle. You always told me that how we respond to injustice defines who we are, James said to the quiet grave. I think I finally understand what you meant. The sun was setting over Detroit, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. Somewhere in the city, Marcus Thompson was finishing his shift, carrying the lessons of redemption into every encounter. Somewhere else, James Williams was reviewing patient charts, using his gifts to fight death and win. Two men, forever connected by a moment of misunderstanding that became a story of grace. Two lives, changed by the power of forgiveness and the belief that people can grow, can change, can become better versions of themselves. Because sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you. Sometimes the person who hurts you becomes the person you're meant to save. Sometimes the ending you never could have imagined becomes exactly the ending you needed, all along.